That these numbers, they don't tell the entire story, and you had a very interesting observation. Love to hear that.
Yeah. I mean, you treat these figures with caution. I mean, broadly speaking, we say more or less the same number of Christians and Muslims, and then you've got, as you say, about 15, maybe 20% who still follow traditional African beliefs. But I always find it very striking in Africa that you find within a family, one brother may be Muslim and one brother may be Christian, and a wife may be Muslim and marries a Christian, and vice versa, and so on. That actually, despite what you read about Boko Haram and so on, and Nigeria and so on, actually there is greater fluidity, and I think that the numbers, have to be treated with a slight dose of skepticism. But yeah, they are the two main religions. I mean, the Jews of Africa have really receded into virtually nothing now, really. Just a couple of thousand in Morocco and a few, elsewhere.
So in that sense, the syncretic tradition of Africa is the African influence on these religions in one way, right? It's not just that these religions were influencing Africa or any area. The movement of ideas is always two ways, both ways, and there's that impact of the local traditions that kind of leaves a trace on history, which then brings us to another aspect which is not very well known in Pakistan, but I think you guys will be very interested in this particular history, the chapters on slavery. Now, of course, everybody knows about Africa and slavery, but few know that the slave trade began with the Arabs. And after the Arabs came in, the European slave trade. So could you tell us a bit about the Arab slave trade, and how do you compare and contrast it with the European slave trade?
So just very quickly, just in terms of figures, yes. So the Arabs went into Africa much earlier, of course, than the Europeans, from the 600s, 7th century, and pretty much started using enslaved Africans. So we say it started about the 7th and 8th century. They took Africans away to work in the salt marshes in what would today be Iraq, on some agricultural holdings and so on. And started about the 8th century, didn't finish until the late 19th century. And it probably involved about 14 million Africans being taken away from their homes. The transatlantic slave trade and the so-called Arab slave trade, some people say that the Arab slave trade, I mean, there were also, Persians and some actually came to the Indian subcontinent, yes, absolutely. So the Indian Ocean slave trade was the main route. So of that 14 million, about 12 million would have gone across the Indian Ocean, because obviously Africa's got, quite a long coast along the Indian Ocean. A smaller number across the Red Sea from, across East Africa to the Arabian Peninsula, and then a small number from what we call, or some people call, sub-Saharan Africa up to the north, where Arab families had settled, because of course the Arabs had finished their conquest of North Africa by 711, and so a lot of Arabs settled in the north and set up some of these, great dynasties later on, a mixture of Arab and Berber blood in them. So those were the three main areas, but most of the Indian Ocean slave trade went across there. And some ended up in, most of them went to Oman. In fact, Zanzibar, as you know, became part of the Sultanate of Oman, and Sultan Said in 1840 actually moved his capital from Muscat to Zanzibar. So those are the kind of, broad figures. The transatlantic slave trade, we sort of say it started in the early 1500s by the Portuguese and the Spanish, but it was started in earnest by the British in 1562, and then it was abolished, or slavery was abolished, the slave trade was abolished in the 1800s, early 1800s, by a succession of European countries. The UK, Britain was about 1807. But that was the slave trade, and slavery, of course, continued until the 1830s. But there were key differences between the Indian Ocean slave trade and the transatlantic one. The transatlantic slave trade accounted for about 12.5 million, so fewer. They favoured men. because they wanted young, strong men to work in, the plantations. They took them to the New World, mostly to South America, not North America. Very few went to North America, in fact. It was mostly the Caribbean and South America, or South America mostly, Brazil in particular. I think only about 15% went to North America. It's just because of Hollywood, you think that they all went there. So they would be taken, across, the Atlantic Ocean, and the back-breaking work that they would have to do. And so the life of a field slave was very short. They die by about 28 years of age or whatever. The Indian Ocean slave trade favored women rather than men. And that was because they liked to have women as concubines. And so women fetched a much higher price, and obviously they didn't have the big plantations that the Americans and the Brits in the Caribbean and so on did. So they favored women. When they did take men, they could be deployed in a different way. There were many different kinds of, types of work they could do, and some of them could work as soldiers, as scribes, as eunuchs. That was one thing that the Indian Ocean slave trade was quite awful about, actually. The Arabs did castrate a large number of men as to work as eunuchs, a horrible operation. Many didn't survive it. But they could do different jobs. The pearl divers, again, not a very nice thing to do. The eardrums would be burst and so on. So, but one interesting aspect is that if an Arab man sired a child with an enslaved African woman, that child would be born free, and in fact could rise to high positions of authority. They would be accepted because strongly patriarchal societies, they would inherit their father's status. In the transatlantic slave trade, if a white farmer, plantation owner, had a child with an enslaved African woman who may have been working in his house or whatever, that child would be born a slave as well. And in fact, there are many accounts of how white plantation owners would actually put their own children to work, on these farms. They were totally born, in a state of enslavement. So that was quite a key thing, a key difference.
This history, of course, kind of creates also this this incredible diaspora that we'll talk about in a bit, the African diaspora, which has influenced different parts of the world, like remarkable influence. But also right after slavery, you have the scramble for Africa, which is one of the most horrific kind of events in modern history, and one can say it kind of gives birth to the new international order. And now we're in the middle of a new kind of an international order, and we will get a chance to talk about that as well, and how African history can pave the way forward. But in terms of the scramble for Africa, the debates that took place, the representation in those meetings. There was a meeting in Berlin in 1884-85 called by Bismarck. If you could tell us a little bit about that history and what that did to kind of marginalizing African voices on the international stage.
So it's interesting to note that in 1870, although obviously the British and the Portuguese and some other European powers were really encroaching on African sovereignty, officially Africa was still, for the most part, in the hands of Africans, sort of. But in 1884-85, the Berlin Conference, the European powers just decided to carve up this continent like a big cake, taking whichever slice they wanted, and that really set into motion the formal colonization of Africa and the formation of African nations. So most African countries that we know today really became formed around that time. And Africans obviously were not represented at all at this gathering, needless to say. And Lord Salisbury, the British Prime Minister at the time, said, we just drew lines on maps. not knowing through rivers, through communities and so on, not knowing, what was what. So we do have these very arbitrary borders, where you see communities are divided up. And that has caused some tensions. It's caused even pressures today that you see. Sudan, where I was born in Khartoum, but I've lived in England since I was 2 years of age. But Sudan was the biggest country in Africa until 2011, when South Sudan seceded. Sudan's now the third biggest country, but that just shows you that was, an example of how these borders were very arbitrary when the South Sudanese obviously engaged in a civil war for many years. So, their pressures. We had Eritrea break away from Ethiopia in the early 90s, and we see the pressures that still exist today. Having said that, I don't think there's anybody in Africa now who would argue for a radical redrawing of these borders. But what it did set into motion is the fact that a lot of people think that the end of slavery meant that it was emancipation and liberty for the Africans. And by the way, on emancipation, I do write about the fact that actually the contribution of Africans themselves in the African diaspora and the Republic of Haiti, the first black republic in the world in 1804, it was formed, really, sent convulsions amongst Africans, and Africans always revolted against their enslavement. They didn't just accept it. So when we talk about abolition, it's not just William Wilberforce. But anyway, the moral arguments for ending slavery are kind of slightly shot away by what happened with the Berlin Conference, because it was quite clear by then, with the massive industrialization that was going on in Europe and North America, that the European powers said, look, actually, we want the raw materials in Africa. We want the rubber, we want the cotton, we want all these, the cotton for the textile mills of northern England. Rubber was being used everywhere in industry. And so we need to keep the labor on the continent. We don't need to take them out to the plantations anymore. So you swapped one kind of formal enslavement for a kind of almost economic servitude. And in places like Angola, the Portuguese, really perpetuated a system of slavery, really. People were given hardly any wages. They were forced off the land. They had no choice but to work for these farmers and so on. So it set into motion the kind of economics of an international order, which still exists today. Africa is still an exporter, by and large, of raw materials to the world, and an importer of manufactured goods. So you can see how, I always say history doesn't only explain the past, it also informs the present, but it also helps you shape the future.
Absolutely. That part is actually one of the most disturbing parts of modern history, and I would encourage all of you to read what happened in Angola, what happened in Congo. We're going to talk a little bit about Congo as well. The kind of debasement, the kind of exploitation of resources that happened. And in a way, the 20th century appears to be a century of the awakening of the African continent, not just the continent, but also the diaspora. And by that, as you show in the book, what we mean is a lot of Africans start rejecting this kind of secondary class status that they had, both in the international order by demanding sovereignty in Africa, but also then starting this remarkable global movement. With people like, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Angela Davis in the U.S., then a lot of activists in Brazil, in the Caribbean. Then, of course, on the continent of Africa, you have people like Patrice Lumumba, you have Nkrumah. In the Arab world, you have African leaders who are leading the Arab world for a while, Jamal Abdel Nasser, Gaddafi, and others. And even today, something like the Black Lives Matter movement, the way it resonates with people all over the world, it somehow feels like some kind of a universal message of emancipation. What do you think was at the core of this moment of national liberation in the 20th century? And what do you think were the outcomes or the setbacks, which you of course discuss in the book?
you referred to Pan-Africanism, which of course was an ideology that started in the late 19th century, early 20th century.